Scotland sits on the very edge of the continent. How European are we out here on the geographical margin? For the second time in as many years, Scotland faces a choice about the kind of country it wants to be. But this time, the United Kingdom will decide whether we stay in or leave the European Union. And Scotland will have just an 8% share of the decision. The possibility that Scotland will vote to stay inside the EU while the UK as a whole votes to leave is not remote, it's real. So what would it mean? Many on the Remain side, from Nicola Sturgeon to William Hague, have warned that it would push Scotland further down the road to independence, that if Britain left Europe, Scotland would eventually leave Britain. But is that true? What would a vote to leave do to the arguments for and against Scottish independence? Well, it changes them. It changes them dramatically. Scotland is a small country with a global reach, and we're quite fond of saying so. In truth, we've forgotten much of our own story. For sure, we remember and celebrate the British Empire Scots who went to Australia, Canada, Africa, India. But there's also been a big continental diaspora, a huge Scottish bootprint in the heart of Europe. The evidence is there if you reach back for it.
So this is a map of the city of Gdansk, or Danzig, as it's called on this German map. And clearly there are two large suburbs, one in the west here, which is called New Scotland, Neuschottland in German, and this one is called the suburb of Scotland, or Écosse, and that's in the south of the city, very close to the densely populated city centre. But both, by the look of them on this map, substantial suburbs.
English MPs sympathised with the poor Poles, who were, they said, overrun with the worst sort of immigrants. This letter of 1615 begs King James VI to stem the flow of disreputable, disruptive and dissolute Scots to Poland. The Polish state saw it differently. In this document of 1655, the Polish king grants trading privileges to two Scots merchants called Daniel McLaughlin and George Drummond. Funny to think that there was a time when ordinary Poles railed against Scottish immigration, when Scots went over there, took their jobs and undercut their tradesmen.
This was a period where the sea united and the land divided, that the east coast ports of Scotland had closer relationships to Bergen in Norway, to Danzig in Poland, Lithuania, and what is now referred to, of course, as Gdansk. Overwhelmingly, those settlements were made up of merchants, petty sometimes, often petty, just hucksters going about selling goods. Some of these Scots, even into the second, third generation, became high officials in some of these Polish, Lithuanian towns.
It was today's dynamic in reverse, Poland offering tens of thousands of Scots a better life than their own country could.
When we think of the country at that time, we think of it as disadvantaged, as poor, as losing out on the race for colonies. But then if you shift the focus and remember that there was indeed not a formal Scottish empire, but a very important Scottish commercial empire in Europe, much more significant than any of the attempts to establish links with the Americas.
The point is this, that before union with England made Scotland part of a non-European global empire, Scotland formed natural links with its neighbours across the North Sea. The Baltic port city of Gdansk has for centuries been a place of European integration, a trading magnet that has drawn in communities of Russians, Germans, Jews, Dutch, Scandinavians, and above all Scots. The Scots formed colonies here, remembered to this day in the names of those suburbs.
We are in the very heart of a district referred to as Stare Szkoty in Polish, which literally means Old Scotland. If you came as a Scot to Gdańsk, you of course could settle in the city if you are wealthy enough. Those less affluent would settle here. So there were breweries, tanneries, shoemakers, bakers, all kinds of profession. And some of them, due to hard work and, well, the entrepreneurial spirit, would arrive at becoming wealthy people.
After the 1707 union with England, Scotland turned to face the Atlantic. Before that, though, generations of Scots on the make landed here. Their first impressions, the architecture, would have chimed with the quays and wharfs of the cities and towns they left behind, recognisably part of the same world. But this place was vastly more opulent, offered vastly greater opportunity for advancement. Most Scots never went back. Slowly, they merged into Polish society. This is a reminder that for most of our history, the sea hasn't been a barrier, but a point of connection. It hasn't separated people, but joined them together. So the communities that inhabit the shores of the North Sea and the Baltic are united by this into a single community, a trading bloc. The sea has been a trading route, a migration corridor, and it would have drawn populations from the seaports of the east of Scotland right across the Baltic and down the Vistula Valley into the very heart of Poland and the heart of Europe. After decades in the deep freeze of communism, Poland is re-emerging as an economic and commercial hub. It is reconnecting with its centuries-old trading hinterland. When they joined in 2004, Poles saw the EU as a way of returning to their natural home. Their economy has been one of the most successful in Europe. They haven't had a single year of recession.
After we started to be membership in the European Union, we are growing. Every year our GDP is growing, our trade is growing.
Do you think Poland has benefited from 12 years in the European Union?
We'll never be able to put so much money to invest without the European Union in our infrastructure. You see the highways, freeways around the cities. During the last 12 years, this development was huge, and without European Union support, it will never be possible, never.
Britain is separated from its neighbours by more than a strip of water. Historical experience separates it too. Unlike Britain, almost all the other EU countries have, within living memory, suffered military defeat and the humiliation of foreign occupation. Poland above all.
Becoming a part of the European Union for Poles, first of all, meant finally security and stability. I mean, finally Poland was coming back to its right place, I mean, to the community of Western Christian nations.
And when you say security, you also mean security for a securely rooted democracy, democratic governance.
I mean, in order to introduce European money to the system, Poland, like every country, had to introduce various procedures and enhance all these elements which used to be suspicious or wicked in terms of transparency, corruption, conduct of governance or quality of governance.
This is a country that was wiped off the map of Europe for 200 years by the competing imperialisms of its two great neighbours, the Germans and the Russians. In the Second World War, it was defeated by both sides, occupied by both sides, first Germany and then the Soviet Union. When it got its liberation in 1989, it came to view the process of European integration not as a threat to Polish sovereignty, but as the best way to protect it, not as a threat to Polish democracy, but as the best way to entrench it. Because the key to both these things lay, as the Poles saw it, in something they hadn't achieved for hundreds of years, a long-term, sustainable peace with their neighbours. That's what the European Union means in a place like this. It's not just about who you trade with, it's something much bigger.
Britain is just not familiar with that experience. In the biting cold of an early morning at Peterhead, there aren't many who think the EU has redeemed Britain's democracy or made more secure its national sovereignty. Britain was, before Europe, an island of coal surrounded by fish, and we don't do much of either anymore. 570. Peterhead remains the biggest fish market in Europe. 55,000 tons of whitefish come through here every year, worth £80 million. It's a lot, but it's nothing like it used to be. Britain has to share its territorial waters with the rest of Europe, and Brussels, not London or Holyrood, decides how much fish the Scottish fleet can be allowed to catch.
In 1975, you voted to stay in the European community. Why did you do that?
We were told that this is going to be for a free market and trading with people, and we just thought it was better. As years went by, Brussels seemed to have more and more control. And every time they used to come back from quota negotiations, more and more restrictions was coming in. It was like a noose that was tightening around our neck all the time.
So that, in your view, is all down to Britain's European Union membership?
Absolutely, no question.
And what do you think of that?
Well, you need to look at the side of my boat, and I think my views is quite clear.
And are you confident that the Leave campaign can win this?
It's going to be a hard fight, but I've waited 40 years for this. And I'll give it the damn best chance I can, like.
We're just across the North Sea here from Norway. We're a lot closer to Stavanger than we are to London. In the early 1970s, the Norwegians were negotiating to join the European community along with Britain. They were meant to become full members on the same day as us. They pulled out at the last minute because of fears of what membership would do to their fishing industry. They opted instead to retain full national control of their vast territorial waters. 40 years on, fisheries are still the second biggest part of the Norwegian economy after oil and gas. A story very different to what happened to fisheries in Scotland.
There's been a lot of pain over the last 20-25 years. This port used to have in excess of 400 vessels sailing in and out of it. We've got about 70 now, but there are 8 in order for next year. And we hope that that'll, with the increase in quotas and I think the greater husbandry of our seas, it all echoes for a good future. We're building a future here in Peterhead. If we get a grant that we're looking for from the EU and from the Scottish Government, this will be knocked down to make way for a new fish market.
But 40 years in the EU has changed the shape of Scotland's economy. Drive a few hours west of Peterhead and you find an emblematic Scottish success story: whisky. A third of Scotland's whisky exports go to Europe. EU clout opens up new markets in growing economies around the world.
This is a cask that once contained muscatel.
And what does it do to the flavour?
I'll show you.
This industry believes it owes that success in part to EU membership. This is a different taste of the EU experience.
We've built our business models around EU membership, access to the single market, access to the trade agreements with other countries, access and support for our intellectual property.
But what do you mean by this? Give me an example of the kind of regulatory or tariff barriers you face around the world that might emerge in Europe if we weren't members.
A good example, for example, is Vietnam. Big emerging market, bigger than a lot of people think. The EU's just agreed a free trade agreement with Vietnam. The current tariff on spirits to Vietnam is 45%. That will go down to 0 under this free trade agreement.
Let's stay in the common market. In Europe we can be great.
The last time Britain voted on membership in 1975, Scotland was one of the most Eurosceptic parts of the UK, second only to Northern Ireland in its doubts about the benefits of Europe. Now that's reversed, with polls showing Scotland second only to Northern Ireland in its support for EU membership. Why? Why have we become more enthusiastic Europeans, while most of the UK has become more sceptical?
Brexit, the campaign to leave the EU, is seen very much as a Conservative Party project. And in Scotland, there are an awful lot of people who will say, well, if the Tories want this, I don't. I think that's a wee bit shallow, but that brings me on to another point, actually, which is, I think, just as important for my campaign. Support for the European Union in Scotland is very widespread. It's not very deep. It's not like support for the UK or support for independence, which is felt viscerally by people.
But the SNP have changed too. They were once for leaving the EU, but a generation ago they adopted independence in Europe as their defining purpose.
I would prefer a European passport in the short term to the UK one I have. I would prefer not to have the flag of the Union Jack, which is now a symbol of hooliganism internationally. I'd rather have a European flag.
The SNP now argued that independence did not mean separating or going it alone. It would still be part of something big and strong.
And talking of the EU, no matter how England votes, we are staying in.
Opinion polls suggest Scottish voters overwhelmingly support staying in. So if Scotland is, as the SNP government puts it, dragged out of the EU against the democratic wish of the people, what will happen? What should happen?
At this stage, I'm not particularly keen to get too far into the realms of speculation about that, for the simple reason that I hope that scenario doesn't arise. I want Scotland to be independent, but I wouldn't choose to have another referendum on the basis that the rest of the UK had chosen to do something that I think would be damaging for the rest of the UK. So I'm going to campaign and argue for not just Scotland to vote to stay in, but the rest of the UK to do so as well.
Do you accept that there will be a question of democratic legitimacy if Scotland votes to stay in the European Union, but Britain as a whole votes to leave?
There's no question of democratic legitimacy at all. I mean, first of all, I think it's really important that Scots approach June 23rd with one question in their mind, which is, should we continue to be members of the EU? That's the only question that's being asked. It's not about Scottish independence. It would be unfair, I think, to the Scottish people and the British people if we put our cross in the box with any other motivation than answering the question.
But could the SNP build a new case for independence on the back of a Brexit vote?
One of the big issues in the Scottish independence referendum was the issue of the currency. That was difficult enough then. The idea of trying to sell the message of Scottish independence on the currency issue in the context of Brexit would be very, very difficult.
Before I say what I'm about to say, this is not me saying that our position on currency was wrong, because I don't think it was. But clearly, that was one of a number of areas where we clearly didn't persuade enough people that what we were saying was as credible as it needed to be. So, when you don't win a campaign, whatever that campaign might be, it would be incredibly arrogant to assume that there was nothing more you had to do in order to persuade people in the future.
There's not much traffic on the bridge at Coldstream these days, but it does carry a heavy symbolic load. It was built in the 18th century when building bridges between England and Scotland was designed to cement two kingdoms into one. In 2014, pro-independence campaigners said a border here wouldn't matter because everything moves freely within the EU anyway. But Brexit would change that. And remember, 64% of Scotland's exports go to the rest of the UK.
So what would this border look like should this bank of the Tweed stay inside the European Union while that bank left? Would there be a customs post here? Would there be passport controls? Would there be immigration checks? Well, maybe that would be necessary. There are some countries outside the EU that have got around this. You can travel, for example, between Sweden and Norway without checks. You can travel between France and Switzerland without checks. Would a similar agreement be possible here? Well, the answer is nobody knows, because nobody, as far as we know, has made a plan for that.
The ideal of a Europe without borders has, in any case, been strained to breaking point. National governments are reimposing border controls to impede free movement.
A sensible, open immigration policy that says we welcome people, but we've got to control.
UKIP has had little electoral success in Scotland, but does that mean immigration is not an issue here?
If you are wealthy enough and cosmopolitan enough, then it makes it easier to get a cleaner for a low wage. But for a lot of working class communities, and the working class communities I represented as an MP, I mean, it has real major impact on housing, on schools and on jobs.
Most of those people work and pay taxes, though. Isn't the immigration community from the European Union a net contributor to the public purse?
Nobody denies that immigration is a good thing. I've always believed, you know, anyone in the progressive left of politics believes that immigration is a good thing. But immigration, unlimited immigration, is not a good thing because it has to be managed.
Do you accept that although it doesn't figure highly on things that Scottish people say they're concerned about, immigration is a problem in Scotland, especially if you're at the lower end of the income bracket?
I absolutely recognise the concerns people have about immigration. I represent a constituency in the south side of Glasgow that has a particular concentration of immigration from Eastern Europe. Notwithstanding some of these particular concerns people have, the fact is, and this is a fact that doesn't get spoken about nearly enough, is that overall immigration from other European countries into Scotland and the UK is a net positive benefit. It actually contributes more to our economy than people coming here take out, if you know, that's not too pejorative a way of putting it, in terms of public services. And that's before we talk about the hugely positive social and cultural benefits of having people come from other parts of the world to Scotland, just as people from Scotland for generations have gone to every corner of the world.
There's a strong argument that Scotland's problem has not been immigration at all, but emigration. In the 20th century, the population of England and Wales grew by 60%. In Scotland, it grew by just 10%. That doesn't suggest a country that has been an irresistible magnet for migrants. It suggests a country that has struggled to hold on to its own young people, who are drawn by better opportunities elsewhere.
There's another part of Scotland's European story that we've largely forgotten. In the 1940s, there were 40,000 Polish soldiers stationed in Scotland. They fought in the liberation of Europe. Many of them settled here afterwards. There's a pleasing symmetry to this, for some of them were descended from Scots who went to Poland in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Underneath, we've got the emblem of Poland.
Why were there so many Polish people here after the war?
Well, many of them, like my own parents, lived in eastern Poland, and in 1940 they were exiled up to Siberia. When Stalin joined the Allies, they then released the people who were in Siberia. They escaped through Romania and so on into France, and then from France into Britain.
What was it like growing up here as a young Polish girl in Scotland to Polish parents who didn't even speak the language?
We were expected to be Polish at home. The minute we crossed the threshold, we were expected to blend in, to be Scottish, to take part in everything that went on.
Poland came into the EU in 2004 and tens of thousands of Polish people came to work in Scotland. That must have had a big impact on the Polish community here, did it?
The church is full of people now, because at one time you had about maybe a dozen grey heads and that was it, but it's now full. And one other thing that's really been a boon for us is we have all these Polish delis now, which means I can get my kielbasa and all sorts of things, which was lacking in the past few years.
That's sausage.
Polish sausage, yes.
Tens of thousands more Poles have come to Scotland in the last decade. Their language is now the second most common in the country. Jacek Korzanowski came to Glasgow with his family as a teenager. You can hear a dual identity, a fusion of Polish and Scottish nationalities, even in the way he speaks.
The idea came through my parents speaking to the co-workers in the previous work. them asking, since there is so many Polish people, why cannot you get Polish food here? I would like to try it. Then idea turned into business.
And how do Polish people integrate here? Do they mix well with the local communities?
I've never felt as being alien here. I've always felt support. I've always felt being welcomed.
And how important is the European Union in all of this?
Poland got partitioned after the Second World War. Unwillingly, we have become part of the Eastern European world. And now we're back in the European Union. We're in the place where we prefer to be.
If I'm going to take a bit of cooked ham, a little taste of Poland home, what are you going to recommend for me?
Maybe that ham in the far left.
But Poland's relationship with the EU is shaped by a radically different historical experience. It is just not the same for the UK. Many Leave campaigners acknowledge the positive role immigration has played here. For them, leaving the EU is not ending the relationship with Europe, not ending cooperation with our European neighbours, simply taking back more control over how we cooperate.
That's very nice, you're right.
It all comes down to trying it, tasting it. People change their opinion.
If we come out of the EU, then all the powers that the European Commission and the European Parliament have over Britain have to go somewhere. They can't just dissolve into the ether. Some of them undoubtedly will come to Westminster, but here in Scotland, when it comes, for example, to fisheries and agriculture, so we would no longer be members of the Common Agricultural Policy or the Common Fisheries Policy. Those would be powers that would be handed to ministers at Holyrood.
The defining purpose of your political life is to repatriate political power, repatriate from Westminster back to Scotland. Why would you not want to repatriate power from Brussels as well?
I want Scotland to be independent so that the choices about when and in what circumstances we pull our sovereignty are our choices to make. But I want an independent Scotland to be an outward-looking internationalist country, playing its part in the world, joining with other countries to deal with the big challenges the world faces. And in the European Union, imperfect though it is, the frustrations that it will bring from time to time, taken for granted, it's better to be in there.
The North Sea has connected Scotland to its neighbours on the other shore for centuries. From time to time, it has also defended Scotland from them. There are defensive emplacements up and down this coast. This month it is time again to decide what kind of relationship to seek. And the result could also change further Scotland's relationship with its single most important neighbour. The one it's connected to not by the sea, but by the land and by history.
Would a vote to leave the European Union propel Scotland further down the road to independence? Well, it certainly changes the independence proposition in ways we haven't even begun to consider yet. And it would confront Scotland with a new national question. Which union do you want to be part of? The British one or the European one? And that's an argument we haven't even started to have yet.
Regenerating parts of Scotland's wild heart, the impact humans have had on the Highlands and what we're doing to put things right. That's tonight at 9 here on BBC One Scotland.
Scotland sits on the very edge of the continent. How European are we out here on the geographical margin? For the second time in as many years, Scotland faces a choice about the kind of country it wants to be. But this time, the United Kingdom will decide whether we stay in or leave the European Union. And Scotland will have just an 8% share of the decision.
So this is a map of the city of Gdansk, or Danzig, as it's called on this German map. And clearly there are two large suburbs, one in the west here, which is called New Scotland, Neuschotland in German, and this one is called the suburb of Scotland, or Écosse, and that's in the south of the city, very close to the densely populated city centre, but both, by the look of them on this map, substantial suburbs.
English MPs sympathised with the poor. The possibility that Scotland will vote to stay inside the EU while the UK as a whole votes to leave is not remote, it's real. So what would it mean? Many on the Remain side, from Nicola Sturgeon to William Hague, have warned that it would push Scotland further down the road to independence, that if Britain left Europe, Scotland would eventually leave Britain. But is that true? What would a vote to leave do to the arguments for and against Scottish independence? Well, it changes them. It changes them dramatically. Scotland is a small country with a global reach, and we're quite fond of saying so. In truth, we've forgotten much of our own story. For sure, we remember and celebrate the British Empire Scots who went to Australia, Canada, Africa, India. But there's also been a big continental diaspora, a huge Scottish bootprint in the heart of Europe. The evidence is there if you reach back for it. Poles, who were, they said, overrun with the worst sort of immigrants. This letter of 1615 begs King James VI to stem the flow of disreputable, disruptive and dissolute Scots to Poland. The Polish state saw it differently. In this document of 1655, the Polish king grants trading privileges to two Scots merchants called Daniel MacLachlan and George Drummond. Funny to think that there was a time when ordinary Poles railed against Scottish immigration, when Scots went over the